In the fall of 2019, a retired history teacher named Gerald Marsh drove his pickup truck down a dirt road in southeastern Utah, following a hand-drawn map his grandfather had left inside an old Bible. He wasn't looking for treasure. He wasn't even sure what he was looking for. But when he crested the last ridge and saw the crumbling adobe walls half swallowed by sage and juniper, he knew he had found something. The outpost had no official name on any modern map. It didn't appear in the state historical registry. But inside those walls, and buried in the hardpan just below the surface, Gerald discovered 20 objects that would rewrite, at least for him and the small community of historians who eventually heard his story, everything they thought they knew about the American West of the 1870s and 1880s. Today we're going to walk through every single one of those fragments, and I promise you that by the time we reach number 1, you will never look at the history of the American frontier the same way again. If you've never been to this channel before, hit subscribe right now because this is exactly the kind of story we tell here every single week. Number 20 is where we begin, and it's stranger than almost anything that came after it. Number 20 was a leather boot, just one, the left foot, size roughly equivalent to a modern men's size 7. What made this boot extraordinary wasn't its construction, though the double-stitched welt and hand-tooled upper were remarkably well preserved for something estimated to be between 140 and 150 years old. What made it extraordinary was what had been carved into the inner lining of the shaft, just above the ankle. Carved with something sharp, probably a nail or a knife tip, were 14 Chinese characters. Gerald photographed the carving and sent the image to a professor of East Asian history at the University of Arizona, who identified the inscription as a proverb, meaning roughly, "The man who hides his face from the mountain still casts a shadow on it." The professor noted that the calligraphy style, even rendered crudely in leather, was consistent with the Guangdong province of southern China, the region from which the vast majority of Chinese laborers emigrated to the American West during the railroad building era of the 1860s and 1870s. A Chinese laborer, far from any railroad line, had left a proverb carved in his native language inside a boot at a military outpost that officially did not exist. The question of why he was there and what happened to him remains unanswered to this day. Number 19 was a tin mess kit stamped with a serial number that, when run through military records by a researcher at the National Archives, came back as having been issued to the 9th Cavalry Regiment, one of the original Buffalo Soldier units. The 9th Cavalry was composed of black enlisted men commanded by white officers, and they served extensively throughout the Southwest and the Great Plains after the Civil War. Their service record was one of the most distinguished in the entire U.S. Army, yet they were systematically excluded from the honor and recognition given to white units. Finding their mess kit at an unmarked outpost added another data point to a growing body of evidence that Buffalo Soldier detachments were routinely deployed to locations and on missions that were never recorded in official regimental histories. Someone wanted their presence in certain places to be invisible. Number 18 was a folded piece of oilskin containing a hand-drawn map that depicted a section of canyon country Gerald eventually identified as being approximately 40 miles from the outpost. On the map, someone had marked 7 locations with small X symbols and written next to each one a 2-digit number. The numbers ranged from 11 to 89. A geologist Gerald consulted suggested the numbers might represent water depth in feet, essentially a survey of hidden springs or seeps in an otherwise bone-dry stretch of desert. If that interpretation is correct, then whoever created this map possessed detailed hydrological knowledge of a region that most settlers and soldiers of the era considered impassable. That kind of knowledge doesn't come from books. It comes from indigenous people, and it raises the question of who at this outpost was talking to the local Ute or Navajo populations and what they were offering in return. Before we go further, drop a comment below and tell me, which of these fragments surprises you most so far? We're barely getting started. Number 17 was a glass medicine bottle, intact, still sealed with its original cork and wax. The label was partially legible and read something like compound tincture of something, the middle word too faded to read, followed by the name of a pharmacy in Santa Fe, New Mexico. When Gerald carefully opened the bottle under controlled conditions, the contents had crystallized into a dark brownish residue that a chemist at a local university analyzed as containing traces of opium alkaloids, consistent with laudanum or a similar preparation that was widely used in the 19th century as a painkiller and sedative. Laudanum was legal, common, and completely unremarkable in the 1870s. What was remarkable was the quantity. The bottle was full. It had never been used, and it was found sealed inside a small niche in the wall that had clearly been deliberately closed over with fresh adobe at some point, essentially bricked in. Someone had hidden an untouched bottle of medicine inside a wall and then sealed the wall over it. Whether they were hiding it from someone else, saving it for a situation that never arrived, or performing some act whose meaning we can no longer interpret, no one can say. Number 16 was a cavalry saber in its scabbard, in remarkable condition given the circumstances. The blade showed no rust, which the dry desert air likely explained. What it also showed, when Gerald examined it carefully under good light, was that it had never been sharpened. The factory edge was still visible, slightly different in texture from the flat of the blade, unmodified since the day it left the armory. The saber had been carried, holstered, maintained, and brought to this remote outpost by someone who either never expected to use it, or who had made a personal decision that he never would. In the military culture of the frontier era, a soldier who refused to maintain a combat edge on his weapon was either incompetent or making a statement. In that environment, making that kind of statement quietly, carrying the weapon but refusing to prepare it for killing, required a specific kind of moral courage. Number 15 was a child's shoe. Not a boot, not a moccasin, but a small leather Oxford-style shoe of the type manufactured in the eastern United States and sold through mail-order catalogs to middle-class families. Size roughly equivalent to a modern children's size 4, worn, the sole nearly through at the toe. Children were not supposed to be at military outposts in the 1870s. The presence of this shoe, clearly used and not discarded as trash but placed carefully upright in the corner of what appeared to have been a sleeping area, suggests that a child lived here for some period of time. Whether that child belonged to an officer who brought his family, to a civilian contractor, or to someone whose presence at the outpost was even more irregular and undocumented, no evidence has emerged to explain. Number 14 was a journal, or rather the remnants of one, 23 pages surviving out of what had probably been a much longer document. The pages were badly water damaged and many words were illegible, but Gerald and a paleographer he hired managed to reconstruct fragments of text across about half the surviving pages. The journal was written in English, but the author occasionally slipped into what the paleographer identified as Spanish, and, in at least 3 passages, into a language neither of them could identify. The fragments that were readable described what sounded like routine military life, guard rotations, supply inventories, the grinding boredom of outpost duty in a landscape the author clearly found both beautiful and oppressive. One passage, only partially legible, seemed to describe a meeting with a group of people the author called the Old Ones, a phrase repeated 3 times across different pages. Whether this referred to an elderly indigenous group, some kind of local settlers, or something else entirely, could not be determined. Number 13 was a collection of playing cards, not a complete deck, only 31 cards, held together by a rubber band so degraded it crumbled when Gerald touched it. The cards themselves were of a design Gerald did not recognize, not the standard American pattern he expected. A playing card historian he eventually tracked down identified them as being from a Spanish-suited deck of the type manufactured in Mexico throughout the 19th century, with suits of coins, cups, clubs, and swords, rather than the hearts, diamonds, clubs, and spades of the Anglo-American tradition. Someone at this outpost had been playing Mexican card games. The American frontier was never as monolithically Anglo as its mythology suggests, but a Mexican card deck at a U.S. Army outpost adds a small, specific, concrete weight to that abstract truth. Subscribe if you haven't already, because next week we have a story about a similar set of artifacts found in a completely different part of the West, and it connects to this one in ways I think you'll find genuinely startling. Number 12 was a pair of spectacles with round wire frames, one lens cracked, both lenses still present. The prescription, when analyzed by an optometrist Gerald consulted, indicated severe myopia in both eyes, what would today be described as approximately -6 diopters. Someone stationed at this remote military outpost had been profoundly nearsighted, unable to see clearly beyond a few feet without correction. In an era when military service routinely required sharpshooting, long-distance observation, and rapid movement across rough terrain, it is difficult to understand how such a person ended up in such a place. The most likely explanations are either that vision requirements were inconsistently enforced, that this individual had been assigned to the outpost for reasons unrelated to combat capability, perhaps as a record keeper, a surgeon, or a specialist of some kind, or that the spectacles belonged to a civilian whose presence, like the child's shoe, represents a story that the official record chose not to tell. Number 11 was a brass compass, functional when Gerald cleaned it and tested it, the needle still responsive after more than a century. What was not functional, or rather what had been deliberately altered, was the degree markings on the bezel. Someone had scratched out the original markings and re-engraved them, shifting every degree indicator by exactly 17 degrees. A compass adjusted in this way would give a consistently false reading to anyone who didn't know about the modification. Navigate by it without knowing what had been done, and you would walk confidently in completely the wrong direction. In the desert southwest of the 1870s, being 17 degrees off your intended bearing for a full day's march could put you so far from water that you would die before you corrected the error. Whoever modified this compass had either created a tool for deliberate deception, or they were using a private system of navigation that only made sense if you knew the key. Either possibility is chilling in its implications. Number 10 was a bundle of letters, 7 of them, tied with twine, addressed to the outpost in care of a name Gerald could only partially make out, something like Sergeant or possibly Sergeant V, the surname illegible. The letters were written in a small, precise hand on thin paper and were signed only with an initial, the letter R. The content of the letters was largely domestic, references to weather, to a sick relative, to the price of flour, to a neighbor's dispute over a fence line. But woven through the mundane details were phrases that struck both Gerald and the paleographer as oddly formal, almost coded. Phrases like "the arrangement continues as discussed," and "your friends here remain in agreement," and "the matter we spoke of in September has been resolved to everyone's satisfaction." Whether these phrases represented actual coded communication or simply the formal register of Victorian correspondence is impossible to determine. But someone had kept these letters, kept them carefully, bound them together, brought them to the edge of the known world, and kept them there. Number 9 was a photograph, a tintype, showing 5 people standing in front of what appeared to be a wooden structure. 4 of the 5 were men in what looked like civilian clothes rather than military uniforms. The 5th figure, standing slightly apart on the right edge of the image, appeared to be a woman in a dark dress. None of the faces were clearly identifiable. What was identifiable, just barely, in the background of the image, was what appeared to be the partial outline of a steam engine or some kind of large mechanical apparatus. There was no railroad, no steam-powered machinery of any kind, recorded as having been anywhere near the location of this outpost in the 1870s or 1880s. Where had this photograph been taken? Who were these 5 people? And why had someone brought this particular photograph to this particular place and kept it as though it mattered? Number 8 was a set of surgeon's instruments in a leather roll, complete, all 12 pieces present, including a bone saw, forceps, scalpel handles without their blades, a tourniquet, and several probes and retractors. The instruments were of high quality, better than standard military issue, suggesting they had been privately purchased rather than drawn from army stores. A historian of 19th century medicine who examined photographs of the instruments identified 2 of the probes as being specialized tools used in surgery for gunshot wounds, specifically for locating and extracting bullets that had lodged near bone. These were the tools of someone who expected to treat a significant number of gunshot wounds. Not the optimistic medical kit of a doctor posting to a quiet assignment, but the battle-hardened kit of someone who knew what was coming. The leather roll showed heavy use, cleaned many times, the outer surface darkened with old staining that Gerald, when he described it to a forensic specialist, was told was probably blood. Number 7 was a small wooden box, approximately the size of a shoebox, whose lid had been nailed shut. When Gerald carefully opened it, he found it contained soil, just soil, packed tightly, filling the box almost completely. Pressed into the top surface of the soil were several seeds, now long dead and desiccated, which a botanist identified as being from plants not native to the American Southwest, including what appeared to be seeds from a fig tree and from a plant in the Artemisia family, associated with regions of Central Asia or Eastern Europe. Someone had carried a box of foreign soil and foreign seeds to this outpost. They had pressed those seeds into that soil. Maybe they were attempting to grow something that reminded them of home. Maybe the soil itself was the point, a piece of somewhere else carried as a talisman or a memorial. Maybe there was an explanation so practical we would find it obvious if we knew it. But we don't know it. Tell me in the comments what you think that box was for, because I genuinely want to know what you think. Number 6 was a military discharge document, official, bearing a seal from the U.S. War Department, issued to a soldier whose name had been carefully, thoroughly, and completely obliterated, scratched out so aggressively that the paper had been torn through in several places. The discharge was dated 1873. The reason for discharge given in the document was disability, but the specific nature of the disability had also been obliterated. What had not been obliterated was the unit designation. 10th Cavalry. Another Buffalo Soldier Regiment. The deliberate erasure of this soldier's name from his own discharge document, a document that was presumably his property to keep and use as proof of his service, suggests that someone, at some point, had a powerful reason to ensure that this particular man could not be identified. Whether that reason was to protect him or to erase him, the effect was the same. Number 5 was a clay pipe. The bowl hand-formed and decorated with incised geometric patterns that an expert in indigenous material culture identified as being consistent with several different southwestern peoples, but not definitively attributable to any one group. The stem was a hollow reed, rather than the carved wooden or clay stems typical of Euro-American pipes. The pipe had been used. The bowl showed heavy carbonization from repeated smoking. At the intersection of the bowl and the stem, someone had tied a small bundle of dried plant material, now brown and crumbling, but identifiable enough that the botanist Gerald consulted recognized it as a mixture of sage and what was probably cedar, both plants with ceremonial significance in multiple indigenous traditions. This pipe, used and carefully preserved, bridged two worlds. Someone at this outpost had been participating in, or at minimum honoring, indigenous ceremonial practices. In the violently polarized context of the frontier Indian Wars, that was not a small thing. Number 4 was a hand-bound book, approximately 60 pages, the cover made from what appeared to be canvas stretched over thin boards. The book had no title, no author attribution. Every page was filled with dense, careful handwriting in a mix of English and what Gerald's linguist contact eventually identified as Diné Bizad, the Navajo language, written phonetically in Latin characters. The book appeared to be a vocabulary list, a dictionary of sorts, with English words and phrases on the left side of each page and their Navajo equivalents, as best as the author could transcribe them, on the right. But it was more than a simple vocabulary list. The author had added notes, attempting to explain not just the words, but the concepts behind them, the ways in which the Navajo terms encoded worldviews and relationships that had no direct English equivalent. This book had been created by someone trying genuinely to understand, not just to communicate, not just to command, but to understand. In the context of an era characterized almost universally by contempt for and systematic destruction of indigenous cultures, this book is a small, fragile, extraordinary monument to a different possibility. Number 3 was a sealed tin cylinder, approximately 8 inches long and 3 inches in diameter, of the type used to store and transport official documents. When Gerald opened it, he found a single rolled piece of paper, in excellent condition, covered on both sides with dense text in a formal official style. The document appeared to be some kind of treaty or agreement, written in both English and Spanish, between, as far as Gerald and his advisors could interpret it, the commanding officer of the outpost, identified only by rank as major, and representatives of two groups, one referred to as the Mineral Springs people, and one referred to only by an abbreviation that no one could expand with certainty. The agreement detailed terms of mutual non-aggression, specified a boundary line using geographical features that no longer existed or could not be identified by their described names, and included provisions for the sharing of water rights during periods of drought. This document, if genuine, represents an unauthorized, informal treaty made between a U.S. Army officer and indigenous groups in direct contravention of official government policy, which in the 1870s was not accommodation, but forced removal. Someone, hiding in an outpost that didn't officially exist, was trying to make peace on his own authority. Number 2 was the most personal object in the entire collection. A small portrait, painted in watercolor on a piece of ivory approximately the size of a modern playing card, of a young woman. She appeared to be in her late teens or early 20s, with dark eyes and dark hair. Around her neck she wore a necklace that an expert in 19th century jewelry identified as being of Zuni origin, a distinctive style of turquoise and silver not made anywhere else. The portrait was painted with obvious skill and with obvious tenderness. On the back, in tiny careful letters, someone had written simply, "She taught me the name of every star visible from this valley." There was no other identification, no name, no date, no context. Just that sentence and the face of a young woman wearing a Zuni necklace painted by someone who had stood in that desert valley and learned to see the sky through her eyes. Who she was, who painted her, what became of either of them, we will almost certainly never know. But that sentence, those 14 words, may be the most important thing found at this outpost, because they tell us that whatever else was happening there, at least one person was paying attention in the deepest sense, learning from someone they were supposed to regard as an enemy, being changed by a place and a person in ways that no official history has ever recorded or will ever fully recover. And now we arrive at number 1, the fragment that Gerald himself said stopped him cold when he found it. The one that he described in the account he eventually wrote as the reason the whole site felt less like a ruin and more like a message. Number 1 was a mirror, a small rectangular-looking glass in a wooden frame, hanging from a nail that had been driven into the interior wall of the main room of the outpost. The mirror itself was not remarkable. What was remarkable was what surrounded it. Carved directly into the adobe wall, creating a frame around the frame, were dozens of names. Not English names, not the names of soldiers or officers. Names in multiple scripts. Some in the Latin alphabet, some in characters Gerald could not identify until a linguist told him they were Cyrillic, several in what appeared to be Arabic script, a few in what the East Asian historian identified as Chinese characters used as personal names. There were also symbols rather than written names, what appeared to be clan or family marks, geometric and pictographic, the kind of personal identifiers used by people who did not write in any alphabetic tradition. Gerald counted 47 distinct names and symbols surrounding that mirror. 47 individuals, from at least half a dozen different linguistic and cultural backgrounds, had stood in front of that mirror and carved their name or mark into the wall around it. They had looked at themselves in that glass, in that nowhere place on the edge of everything, and they had said, "I was here." Whatever official history was writing or not writing about this outpost, whatever missions were being run and denied, whatever treaties were being made in secret, and whatever languages were being learned in private, 47 people had stood in that room and insisted on being counted. The mirror still hung there when Gerald found it, still reflecting whoever stood in front of it. He stood there for a long time, he said, just looking. We have reached the end of the 20 fragments, and I want to sit with what they add up to for just a moment. What they describe is not the West of myth, not the West of white hats and cavalry charges and the inevitable march of civilization. What they describe is a place of radical complexity, a place where people from China, from West Africa via the American South, from Mexico, from Navajo and Ute and Zuni communities, from Eastern Europe and God knows where else, were thrown together in the harshest possible conditions and were, against all official expectation and often in defiance of official policy, talking to each other, learning from each other, protecting each other, and in at least some cases, loving each other. The outpost had no name. The people in it were, for the most part, invisible to the history being written at the time. But they left these 20 fragments, and Gerald Marsh found them, and now you know about them. History is not what was written down. History is what actually happened, and what actually happened is almost always stranger, richer, and more human than anything the official record chose to preserve. If this story moved you, share it with someone who loves history. Leave a comment telling me which fragment hit you hardest. And if you want more stories like this one, from the margins and the silences and the places that don't appear on any official map, then you know what to do. We'll see you next time.